Welcome, everybody. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Quincy Institute. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Tom Stevenson. Uh, Before I do, if questions, which I hope you will have for Tom, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass them on. I'll come to that in about half an hour. Tom, welcome. It's a great pleasure to introduce you today. I've been reading you for years. Tom Stevenson is contributing editor at the London Review of Books, which in my biased opinion is now probably the most interesting intellectual journal in the English-speaking world today. And he writes regularly on energy, defence and international politics for the Financial Times and the BBC, amongst other places. And he has reported from Ukraine, the Middle East, and North Africa for these publications. So we're here today to discuss his book, Someone Else's Empire, British Illusions and American Hegemony, which I hope you will all run out and buy. So, Tom, welcome. I thought on the subject of British illusions, I might begin with an anecdote of my own. Back in early 2008, I was invited to an international affairs think tank in London as one of the discussants of the new Labour government's national security strategy. And the very title itself, of course, was an imitation of the American NSS. And when it came to the discussion, I pointed out to this audience of, junior ambassadors, colonels and brigadiers from the army, sort of undeclared people from the intelligence services and so forth, that if you're talking about British strategy and an absolutely critical question, which wasn't mentioned, of course, in the NSS, was the terms and limits of, if any, of Britain's commitment to the alliance with the United States and to US policies in various parts of the world. This, of course, coming soon after the invasion of Iraq. And so I said I would, really like to hear the views of members of the audience on this subject. And the response was most remarkable. They looked at the ceiling. They looked at the floor. They looked out of the window. They didn't look at me, and they took great care not to look at each other. There was a dead silence, and this silence went on and on until the chairman of the meeting coughed in a somewhat embarrassed fashion and changed the subject. So I wanted to begin by asking you, in your view, how far are these British illusions about Britain's role in the world and Britain's role in relation to the United States? How far are these illusions genuine? Are they real illusions? And how far are they, shall we say, either constructed illusions or willed illusions, in your view, in Britain?
Thank you, Anatol. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. That's, I think, an excellent question, and it's one that the book does try to address. And my answer is really that I think what began as a self-conscious attempt to remake Britain's position in the world has since turned into an illusory attempt to understand that position. And what I would say, what I mean by that, is that there was a time when the more fundamental questions of whether, for example, Britain could refer to itself as a global power, and the catchphrase, for those who don't know, in the last few years has that the British government has tried to put forward is global Britain. This idea has very much been tried to be put to the fore. There was a time when these questions were looked upon with a certain degree of self-referentiality. But in my view, they have since sort of drifted over into the illusory realm. And you could sort of have a good debate to think about when that really took place. I'd like to start really at the beginning on that, at the height of British Empire, at the pomp, as it were, and with also one of the great thinkers of that period, of the early 20th century, with Aya Crowe, who was a great British diplomat, one of the foremost minds in the Foreign Office at the time. In 1907, he had said that the general character of England's foreign policy, he said England, we would today say Britain, of course, is determined by two things, two immutable conditions. The first was Britain's geographical situation on the ocean flank of Europe as an island state, which also had vast overseas colonies and dependencies. And the second was that the survival of that system was bound up, the survival of it as an independent community was bound up with the possession of preponderant sea power. Those are the two pillars. Well, within one generation, the preponderant sea power was gone. By the 1930s, that was very clearly belonged to the United States. And within two generations, the vast overseas colonies and dependencies were gone too. It was clear, I think, to everyone in say British policy, foreign policy community, as we would call it today, by the 30s, that the game of world power was one for subcontinental scale powers. You needed the scale of a United States, of a contemporary China, of a Russia, the population, the landmass, and so forward. And without the vast overseas colonies that Britain once possessed, that was no longer possible. Still, there had to be some sort of evolution in understanding. And that took place with a great deal of difficulty through the loss of empire, mostly in the 1960s. And Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State, in 1962 was responsible for actually not one but two comments that really struck Britain, despite the fact that he was notoriously an Anglophile. The first was that Britain had lost empire and not yet found a role. And the second, much lesser known, which he wrote to US Ambassador Robert Schetzel, also in 1962, was that the key for the US perspective was to try to get Britain to act in a new role as a lieutenant of the United States. Both those comments ended up being consequential, even though they were taken badly in Westminster and in London. But the central argument of my book is that something like that schema, in fact, did take place. Britain gave up on the idea of being a residual great power, struggling with the new lay of the land internationally, and ended up finding a new role, which was bolting itself to the US. That required sort of fitting into a specialist niche, not having the military power, not having the economic might. Britain had to find ways to make itself useful, partly in the patchwork of European politics, partly as, a reliable gratis mercenary later, certainly by the time of Iraq, that comes to be true. And so there was a real transformation, I think, at first self-conscious and then to some extent unconscious. So that the trend of the late 20th century for Britain was not a resurgence of Britain as an independent European power, but really a kind of new surrogacy. And Britain responded ultimately, I think, to the magnitude of the 20th century and of American power in the 20th century by seeking to become an eternal ally of the United States, contrary to Lord Palmerston's famous assertion that Britain or a state can have no permanent allies, only permanent interests. The move was to make of the United States a permanent ally.
On that score, could I ask, are we even really very useful to the United States anymore? Because our military contribution in Iraq and Afghanistan was, to put it mildly, not impressive. And of course, as you suggested, much of the importance of Britain for America over the past two generations has been Britain's role in the EU, to influence the rest of Europe and block things that America didn't like. And of course, since Brexit, that is over. So what does Britain actually do for the US these days?
Yeah, I think it certainly would be a mistake to argue that Britain was somehow critical to the functioning of American power, and that if only British political elites were to get their act together, from a critic's perspective, get their act together and withdraw their cooperation with that this would have some sort of, grand world ordering consequences for the US global project as it exists. I'm sure we'll talk about the extent to which it still exists. I think that would be a mistake. In fact, in Britain, there is still very much, and I think here again, questions of illusions or other delusions come in. there is still very much this idea that Britain can play a Greece to Rome, can play the wise advisor to the United States, can position itself as a guiding hand behind the scenes, having seen it all and done it in the past itself. But in fact, certainly Britain's practical contributions are reasonably limited. Nonetheless, while they are limited, I still argue that they exist and that they are real. Number of ways. The most prominent, I think, is probably the earliest, which is in terms of the provision of intelligence based services. This is today primarily in signals intelligence rather than human intelligence, but still, what Britain could offer in 1945 and still today was a degree of geographic scope which the US did not have. While the US was incomparably larger and, of course, had and still has its own formal, in fact, international empire and overseas territories, the British overseas territories, even though many of them are relatively unpopulated, were still extremely useful as listening posts. Cyprus is perhaps the best example of this. Diego Garcia is another. There are others in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and indeed initially in what were once called the White Dominions, especially in Australia and New Zealand, although of course that's something which has since morphed through the Five Eyes Agreement and also through now more recently through AUKUS. That was very useful and it was practical. It's proved very handy, in fact, even as we see in contemporary events. If you look at Gaza, to have the logistical fact of the British bases on Cyprus on hand to be made useful for the Americans. Another, I think, important factor has been a way to avoid American diplomatic isolation. At certain key moments when the US has wanted to flex its muscles or has decided that some issue is very important, and much of the world disagrees, it has been useful that the UK has been on hand both to provide a certain veneer of multilateral action and also sometimes to marshal multilateral action, whether that's within Europe, or within the Commonwealth, or elsewhere. So that's been another fact. And then the other is that there's been a sort of provision of reinforcements. Today, Britain's armed forces are somewhat ramshackle and unable to fulfill, even quite basic needs because of the general economic malaise which is setting within the country, which is primarily a domestic fact as well as a secular, matter of international global economy. But still, at times having 10% reinforcements of a relatively high-tech military force, and one which is critically actually subject to fewer constraints in terms of transparency than the United States forces are themselves, is useful. British special forces and so on actually aren't subject to many of the checks the limited checks that are in place in the United States. So that, sometimes that's useful. That was useful during the War on Terror, for example, the War on Terror. Several times. And in fact, it's only now, many, many years after the fact, now the stakes are lower, that there are, right at the margins, there are prosecutions and scrutiny of the actions of British special forces during those wars. So that's handy too. So in a number of limited, but I would counter important ways, Britain has found a way to make itself useful, while, again, not wanting to entertain some of the more grandiose visions of, wisely guiding the youthful American project.
No, indeed. And when it comes to limits, are there any limits anymore? You mentioned Gaza. I have been very struck, I must say, by the conformity of both party leaderships and most of their parties in Britain to the American line on Gaza, to, I think, a much greater extent than would have been the case 30 years ago. You would have seen much more pushback, actually, among the Conservatives as well as Labour. So, is this a fair portrayal as far as the Gaza issue itself is concerned? And more generally, what are the limits, if any, to this usefulness?
Yeah, I think limits in terms of British enthusiasm for tacking on to whatever the issue of the day is for the United States, I think have more or less been removed. What I would call strategic Atlanticism is now dominant in much of Europe. So it's not a trend that is completely confined to Britain as a particular case. And I think one can divine also a somewhat similar pattern in Australia. At least it's not totally dissimilar. And that reflects, the sheer power of the US global project. But in the UK, I think partly because the anxiety for global influence, and in London, for example, the need to avoid being seen as what one British diplomat many years ago in the 60s, Conor O'Neill, once described as a greater Sweden. The idea of avoiding being a greater Sweden is still very keenly felt. Whereas, I mean, the irony, of course, is that being a greater Sweden for most of the citizens of the UK is a sort of an unattainably positive goal, completely out of reach. But nonetheless, that anxiety is there. So cribbing to the US line, standing behind Washington and nodding, I think, is very much the dominant style in British politics, if there can be said to be a style in foreign policy at all in the UK. So much so, really, that even in official strategic documents written in London, it's amazing. There's direct cribbing from the US lines. I mean, quite literally, officials read American strategic documents and copy out phrases sometimes, and certainly concepts. We see that in many examples. So that's there. They stand behind the United States and nod, and combined with a sort of a reflexive bellicosity, a very easy resort to force internationally wherever it is possible. And fortunately, in Britain, it's less and less possible, but wherever it is possible, that's still very strong. And so I think really there's a real question now in terms of Britain in the European context. There's a question of a kind of strategic competition between Britain and Germany in terms of the intellectual culture and the political culture. It's a sort of a race to the summit in terms of who can prostrate themselves more. That's the mood of the current moment. And of course, the summit in this case is really a chasm of smug mediocrity.
Mm. Yes. I mean, one question actually from the audience is about this. I mean, it is, after all, generally acknowledged, even within the British security elites, that Iraq turned into a disaster. And of course, the British intelligence services played their own role in that, the dodgy dossier and so forth. Have you found any worry in the security establishment, in the uniformed military, about the potential disasters into which this lieutenant role could lead Britain, but also, I mean, specifically the British Armed Forces?
I must say that I have not. It is not that there is not deep concern within both the security establishment and within the armed forces themselves, but the concern is very much about what a perception of declining British capability. And that goes back to Iraq as well, because in Iraq, it was clear, I mean, to almost everybody within the first couple of years that it was a complete disaster. But what happened in the British context was peculiar, which is that the British armed forces, and to some extent the intelligence services, went into that war believing that they could offer the United States real experience in terms of counterinsurgency. The line again and again was, look, we've done this before. We're experts because of Northern Ireland. And they really believed that. And unfortunately, within about a year, that was turned out to be more or less completely fraudulent. In fact, American generals had to sort of basically stop listening to the British wherever they could, because it was a disaster every time they listened to them. That was completely exposed. And then, while the war itself was a strategic disaster and a moral disaster and a terrible crime, it was also a practical disaster for the British Army. Because time and again, where British forces were actually given something practical to do, they ended up making a hash of it. And as a result of that, there was a great deal of soul searching that happened in Britain about the war. But primarily it happened in terms of why were we not able to do a better job with the tasks we were given, not in terms of the general strategic questions. How did we get into this war? How does our foreign policy's connection with the United States and that relationship keep leading us into these kinds of debacles? And I think that's continued, whether it's Libya, Yemen, or indeed Gaza. I mean, 4.5 million dead in the global war and terror wars. Britain very often deeply involved in them, in a relatively marginal sense, in a strict way, but nonetheless deeply involved. Those questions have been subsumed under the questions of how is it that we can increase our capabilities so that we aren't embarrassed in front of American generals. That's very much been the idea. And so where there's a transition, right? In Vietnam, there is, although it's a myth that Britain was not at all supportive of that war and provided no support to the United States, there was a great deal of reluctance to send troops or to be directly involved at scale. In Iraq, that by the time of Iraq, that is completely overturned in favor of completely enthusiastic support and a desperation, in fact, to be involved at every turn. And when Iraq turns out to be a debacle, the soul searching and the recriminations even that go on are very much about why we failed to have the right equipment, why we weren't able to impress with counterinsurgency and that sort of thing. So I think that's very much ended up being that's the defining question, and it remains the question. The question today is how can we get more money into the system and make sure we do a better job so we aren't so embarrassed.
This is somewhat off topic, but I didn't cover Iraq, but I did spend a good deal of time in Afghanistan, and where, of course, Britain previously had been so involved. And it struck me so forcibly that on the one hand, so much of British behavior and attitudes do go back to an unacknowledged imperial nostalgia, for when Britain was a world power. And yet, I was amazed that officers from regiments with, Afghan battle honours on their regimental flags had made no effort seriously to study Afghanistan or the British experience in Afghanistan or what that might teach us today. And all too often, I mean, not everyone by any manner of means. There's an excellent book by Mike Martin, for example, a captain in the British Army, about Hellman, but all too often just repeated platitudes about building democracy and freedom and so forth. I found that odd. And partly, of course, it does demolish this idea of being, Greeks to the American Romans and teaching them things. If in fact we do not actually study our own history and experience, what do we have to offer in terms of advice? It's like, the famous attributed remark about Tony Blair by one of his advisors that when it came to Iraq, the prime minister lives in an ahistorical zone.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's right. And my book is not a full historical or sociological account of that process, but my initial thought would be that imperial nostalgia does remain an unusually potent force in Britain, beyond even post-imperial Spain or Portugal. And yet it is almost a storybook version. And I think that sort of accounts for that gap between the reality of the traditions and the history and the understanding of them, which I think is unfortunately quite hollow. And more generally, the idea of tradition, and it is a multi-generational tradition in Britain, has been to view foreign policy, even when it sort of has a conjuncture with imperial history, as a sort of technocratic predilection. It's something either for extremely anorak specialists or for eccentrics or for liars. And so the central questions are not political questions which one can argue over and debate and bring up historical examples for. They are to be left outside the realm of national politics. It's almost as though the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and indeed anyone else who wants to entertain national life, have made a tacit agreement that politics stops at the channel. And the rest is for the defense intelligentsia, for ideology professionals, so that the few foreign policy questions which do get raised or force themselves to the fore, as they did in Iraq, when it was inevitable that these things must be discussed, they do so in a sort of a figurative way. They become disguises for domestic political battles or for some other sense of culture war. And I think one can see that process also at work in the United States in some ways, but in Britain it's very advanced. So I think that is sort of probably part of the picture as well.
I mean, you've probably answered this already, but one question from the audience: will Labour's predicted victory in the next British elections make any significant difference, do you think, to Britain's foreign and security policies?
I do not think that it will. In fact, I think that on the contrary, we already have every indication that the plan is for it not to do so. Labour leaders from Keir Starmer down, if we look, for example, at Gaza, which has inevitably been the issue, the du jour issue, have said multiple times that in the British Parliament they would not be able to vote for any substantive statement on, say, the issue of a ceasefire because it's an election year. And what is meant by that is that they expect to be in power and they don't want to have, legally, formally committed to Parliament any position that they have no intention of taking when in government. And I think that gives us a very clear idea of that there. In fact, there was a time when even the Conservative government or the more right-wing forces in Britain seemed more likely to be willing to mount a challenge on nationalist grounds to Britain's general foreign policy position. The same idea of, narrowly national interests, for an example, local nationalist rejection of the idea of a global outlook, as perhaps something that's cooked up by the finance guys and the arms companies. There was a brief period when that looked like it might be a future matter of some valence. It did not work out in that way. And if anything, the Labour Party, I think, has, really stuck with the idea foreign policy is a technocratic idiosyncrasy. It's to be produced in conclave. In principle, there was a time when Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader, a man very much at the left of the internationalist tradition, of the socialist tradition, where a real political challenge could have been launched had he in fact been able to marshal a kind of a national level political coalition that could govern. But the trouble with that, I think, ultimately was that vested interest in the country, were able to defeat him politically, whether that's media, business, and so on. It was simply too daunting of a challenge. And that, ultimately Britain's an island and its political life is relatively parochial and relatively inward looking, even though its foreign policy decidedly is not. So I am somewhat pessimistic about, the Labour position on that side. I see it very much as a business as usual party that's clear very, very much in the Gaza debates, for example. I mean, just to round it off, in fact, it was someone from the Defense Intelligentsia, from RUSI, which is the most prominent military and intelligence think tank in the United Kingdom, David Lidington, who said, well, look, the differences between the Conservative Labour, the Scottish Nationalist Party, the Liberal Democrats over Gaza are actually tiny. And, it's a pity the whip's officers can't get around and get everyone to craft a statement that everyone can agree to. And he's right. The political differences among the national parties are, in fact, tiny on this question and on many other questions, including the relationship with the United States.
What are the possibilities in the long term of a political revolt against this? Of course, one of the factors, one sees it here in America as well, in Michigan, much more strongly, I think, in northern England, it is, of course, the presence of a growing Muslim population, which is most decidedly not happy with American policy in the Middle East. And there was one by-election, does not a general election make, but there was the Rochdale by-election. Is this, do you think, going to play an important role at some point in future?
Well, the potential is there. And I would say it is not only, say, for example, the Muslim population in the United Kingdom. It is also what I would describe as a remarkable gulf that exists between the opinions of the general population, very well polled, on Gaza or on practically any other question that you might fit into the idea, the rubric of Anglo-American power globally, but especially on Gaza because it's such an important and such an emotive topic. There is a chasm between general popular opinion and the opinion within Parliament and within the national political class. It is a night and day difference, and it's remarkable. So there is a question as to for how long that sort of shift can remain. How long that there can be such a great degree of misalignment. There's an enormous amount of support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. There's an enormous amount of support for checking the use of force internationally. Again and again, we see it. And yet, at the level of national politics, it is simply not reflected. And so that is something that contains the possibility. one could imagine that some sort of change could be possible, at least in principle, some sort of real political challenge could be launched about these questions. And Britain also has the international latitude. It is not a country that is completely constrained in its relationship with the United States. Should it wish to, it could adopt a policy of what I would call principled non-cooperation, in the way that, to give an extreme example, Iceland does, or even a much more limited example, Finland does, even though as a member within the NATO alliance and so on. That's entirely on the cards, and it would be supported by the general population, and yet we don't see it. The only addendum I would put to this question is that perhaps more powerfully than political changes are the sort of level of economic changes, which is that the real decadence, the sense of the false economy in terms of the state as practically a religious tenet, has become so powerful within Britain that there's a real question that fear about capacities does end up intruding inevitably on policy. That is simply the inability, as the capacities of the British state, not only to provide, a large professional army, but also to provide, decent public services and so on, becomes so extreme, and that's very much the trend, that these questions really are forced to the fore nationally. That the incapacity to maintain the role that Britain currently plays ends up expressing itself politically one way or another. That seems to me to be quite likely at some point.
We have a couple of questions. One, can you think of any recent examples of disagreement that have in any way shaken this relationship on the part of the British? And specifically, the fact that, of course, contrary to all the promises before and during and after Brexit, Britain has made, I don't mean US promises, I mean by British politicians. Britain has made no progress on a new trade deal with the United States. Is this having any effect that you have observed?
Actually, it's been remarkable how little effect that has had, because during the heady days of the Brexit campaigning, the idea of new trade deals with especially with the United States, but also with, internationally, was, very much part of the national psyche. The idea that Britain was sort of going to have its wings freed by leaving the European Union, which in my view was always fanciful, was nonetheless very prominent. And the fact that that simply has not, that has not taken place whatsoever, eventually there's going to have to be some very serious compromises, which Westminster politicians have not wanted to have to make in order to get a decent trade deal with the United States. A bullet is going to have to be bitten on these questions. And that, I think, has not fully sunk in yet. But this has really not intruded in terms of a challenge to whether or not Britain should have some other kind of role. I think because of that inherent ambivalence with regard to having recently taken a divisive but nonetheless a fundamentally completed decision to leave the European Union, the idea that one could return to being a modestly prosperous, European state playing some kind of financial Hong Kong style role to the European continent as a whole as the central focus, that's become less and less likely and seen as less and less realistic. So, it's an excellent question as to why that there has not emerged a kind of an anger or a feel of betrayal. This idea that, British politicians do not say, we helped you guys out in Iraq or whatever else, and therefore, why are you treating us with, why are you treating us so roughly? And I don't think it's likely that will happen. That will happen either. But there are certainly some real compromises that are going to have to be made, and it's going to be ugly in some respects for Britain economically, apart from anything else. So it will be interesting to see how that develops.
I mean, on that score, there is, of course, a real possibility that Donald Trump will be the next US president. And I mean, not just from Trump, but wider sections of the Republican Party and some sections of the security elite saying that America must really reduce its security commitments in Europe in order to concentrate on what they regard as the far greater threat from China. How much concern is this causing in Britain? And is there any serious thinking about how Britain would act in these circumstances? I mean, the logical thing, of course, would be precisely to try for serious integration into European security. But of course, Brexit makes that considerably more difficult.
Yes, absolutely. In my view, the attitude within the British sort of security defense nexus, and indeed among politicians, is that most find Trump's politics and general style to be distasteful and abrasive. However, I do not see that they necessarily view a Trump presidency in quite the same terms as is even the case in, say, Germany or France. Having already been through a Trump presidency once, there's no doubt that there are concerns. But I think the general attitude has often been that while Trump may talk a tough game, he represents continuity in terms of the American global position more than revolution. It's obviously true that Trump is a different kind of president than Joe Biden is. And, one could say an awful lot about that, everywhere from Eastern Europe to Iran to China and so on. But nonetheless, I think the view is that certain interests will end up coming to the fore in the United States, even with the Trump presidency. That the talk of isolationism, while not completely false, is still sort of a term of abuse wielded by, perhaps the permanent elements in the foreign policy community, rather than necessarily being an accurate description of the Trump worldview. It's possible, of course, that perspective could turn out to be completely mistaken for various reasons that are, sort of endogenous to the United States politics. But there is not really even though I think many foresee the likelihood of a second Trump presidency, it is not treated as a coming apocalypse. There are certainly real concerns, but I think some also view it as a potential opportunity. A way to remake NATO with even greater British influence, try and use that as an excuse to shoehorn in 3% military spending as a percentage of GDP, even despite the decline elsewhere. So it's a somewhat of a mixed bag. And of course, on the right, there are admirers the right is ascendant in some respects on the Conservative Party, if not in national life in its totality. And there are plenty of Trump admirers who like some of what they hear and don't mind too much of it.
Mm.
Incidentally, sorry to have to add this on, but I would say that there could be a rude awakening there, because not just Trump, but also in the Biden administration, the prospect of future confrontations with China is taken very seriously. And I heard Colin Kahl, for example, who is the former Undersecretary of Defense, say very clearly that the expectation in Washington is that in the event of any kind of confrontation with China, at any stage of the escalation ladder, the expectation is that Britain will be along for the ride. And I don't know if that's fully appreciated in the UK, except among the real specialists in terms of defense and intelligence.
Yes, I have a hideous feeling that naming our second aircraft carrier, assuming it's even capable of sailing, the Prince of Wales, was a singularly bad omen. If one remembers what happened in December 1941 in the Far East.
Indeed.
They might have chosen, warspite or another name for it. A question, how important is the merging of personnel and institutions when it comes to this, well, relationship, to call it that? We see that this has gone very far indeed. I mean, to the point, I think, of was complete symbiosis in the financial world, in the think tanks, foreign security think tanks anyway in Britain, in the in sections of the media, and obviously in the intelligence services. How important is this interchange of personnel and careers? And what, if any, fields are not merged so far?
Well, I think within the society of, let's say, national security clerks, this sort of thing is treated as very interesting. And it also, it's very important for careers and so forth. Uh, we see frequently that, senior American think tankers, academics, and so forth come over and take up prominent positions in the British think tanks, that sort of thing, prominent positions in national life, and have a lot of respect for doing so. It doesn't happen as much in the other direction for obvious reasons. But I think the idea that in institutions like Chatham House, which is probably the foremost, let's say, diplomatic style think tank with some Mandarin propensities in the UK, ISI, these kinds of institutions really do value a sense that they are well integrated into the American foreign policy community, even though, in fact, the structure of the US foreign policy community and, people who are actually able to, in national security and so forth, is completely different than it is in Britain. It's far more transparent in many ways. As I said before, foreign policy in Britain is still largely made in conclave in a way that's not quite true in the US. So that's there. And I think the other question is when it comes to overt military power, which is that for many years now, if you look at, say, the really advanced, J2 directorate in the US military and so forth, the idea of interoperability has been treated as very important for the future, and something that's seen, within the context of proxy forces, working with partners, all of that sort of thing. And Britain has tried as far as possible to take the lead on those matters, to make military systems, personnel, communication systems, all of that as far as possible so that they fit into the jigsaw without, too many rough edges. So that's an important trend as well, and that's something that we see now also becoming a trend in the new security relationships with Japan and with Australia and so forth. So I think in Britain, that's taken as something that's been a success.
From that point of view, a question, how important is the nuclear relationship in this regard? And can, in fact, Britain be said to have an independent nuclear deterrent, or is it simply part of America's nuclear forces?
This is, in fact, a sensitive issue in the UK because it is always maintained by prime ministers, by senior members of the civil service, that Britain has an independent nuclear deterrent and is always referred to in those terms. What Britain, of course, has is nuclear weapons. Deterrence is ultimately a conceptual matter. With regards to the independence, there's just no question, and we've had the data for a long time, that all of the systems are totally dependent on maintenance and production capacities in the US. And even aside from that, there isn't a need for a kill switch on every launcher that can be operated in Washington. The simple strategic fact is because of everything that we've been discussing, the political and for matters of exigency, British nuclear forces remain a small, well-placed addendum of America's overall nuclear picture in a way that, say, French nuclear forces do not quite, even though even France is obviously not free to decide when and where it uses nuclear weapons without consulting any other nuclear power, certainly the United States first among them. But Britain, to an even greater extent, really is dependent on that. So when we see, for example, there has been recently a true reversal in terms of British nuclear weapons policy, which is that having had years of steady decline in terms of the number of warheads and so on, there now are clear plans in place to increase the nuclear arsenal of the UK. That's a major decision that was taken. It was taken outside of Parliament. It was taken without any kind of really any kind of popular consultation. It was just announced by the government, and it is now in place. So that's there. The big worry, I think, is, and perhaps this is even a worry in Washington, you would have to tell me, is whether Britain is any longer seen as ultimately reliable in these questions, because there have been scandal after scandal in terms of the warhead assembly plants that have to be nationalized, that end up getting delayed for 6 years, treatment facilities that have their capabilities set back, the hosting of intelligence sites by private contractors, which turn out to end up being a debacle, the facilities for handling uranium and so on. all of this stuff has been a very serious problem. And so I think there's a need, and it is recognized now in Britain. There's been a recent initiative that there's a need to get the house in order. But yeah, it's to get the house in order so that Britain can continue to serve ultimately as part of the overall picture directed by the United States in terms of the global nuclear balance.
I mean, it seems to me there certainly is concern in American security establishment about, I mean, frankly, just how good as well as how numerous the different branches of the British Armed Forces are today. But of course, this is to some extent a problem created by America itself, because in, following America's agendas, Britain over the past couple of generations, swung from its Cold War configuration to, global interventionism, hence these aircraft carriers, which are breaking down regularly and don't have enough escort vessels, because in the end, we couldn't generate either the money or the industrial base to do this properly. At the same time, of course, funding this and funding, the renewal of the nuclear deterrent, even though, as you've said, with multiple problems, to a great extent, stripped the army. And of course, as a result of Afghanistan and Iraq, there was then this concentration on the on British special forces, which are indeed, I mean, pretty good. But now, of course, we are thinking that because of what's happened in Ukraine, actually we need a much bigger conventional army. But the melancholy fact of the matter is that Britain just cannot financially do these four things simultaneously on anything like an adequate scale. And so in area after area, we find that the capability is just not there. Now, as is often said, there is an answer to this. This is, I mean, equally true of the French and the Germans and the Italians, which is, of course, really pooling European military resources. But that requires, of course, very hard choices about who does what and who gets what, which it seems, I mean, once again, not just us, but I mean, all the European countries are incapable of making. Is that fair, do you think?
Yes, I think that's quite fair. In fact, I would, to go further on what we were saying before, I would say that the main force restraining or acting as a kind of counterbalance to the general strategic direction that Britain has taken, and indeed the main force restraining international bellicosity in Britain, which is a historically important trend, is not necessarily a counter political movement, but economic malaise. I think I would go so far as to say that is the central fact there. And with regard to European, I mean, to put it in French President Emmanuel Macron's terms, strategic autonomy, I think that has ended up being more a paradigm for funding European, especially French arms companies than any kind of real prospectus. And so in Britain, there are, for example, Britain is still a member of the E3 forum with France and Germany. There are, residual forms of cooperation, and of course in NATO, which have not been damaged by Brexit. But the idea of either under the United States or simply in alliance with it, Europe emerging as a fourth power alongside the United States, Russia, and China at that sort of level is, I think, still not taken seriously either in Britain or anywhere in continental Europe. And critically, it is also, I think, not taken seriously in the United States. If European strategic autonomy, in the full meaning of that term, were to become a realistic prospect, I think we would see some level of concern about it in the United States, because it would start to challenge American interests. Right now, the United States is the dominant military power in Europe, as it has been at least since 1989, and one could argue a good, a long time before that as well. And that remains the case. So NATO-Politism, strategic Atlanticism still remain, I think, the most likely path forward, even if there are some in the US, perhaps on the right, who like the idea of Europe becoming an independent power, like the UK, an eternal ally of the United States, but capable of really holding its own, so that the US can focus on China.
I mean, there is also, it seems to me, I mean, a fundamental, what do you call it, dysfunction or unreality in Macron's thinking, because if indeed Russia is to be portrayed as a mortal threat to Western and Central Europe, I mean, not just to Ukraine, obviously, that's obvious, then the idea that Europe is going to do without the United States becomes ridiculous, right? And on that score, a question, I mean, Britain's policy on Ukraine, which has sometimes seemed actually to get ahead of the US. But when it came to Boris Johnson's famous or notorious trip to Kiev, in which he, how critical this was, I don't know, but in which he certainly argued very strongly against a peace deal at that point. Was this just Boris, or do you think he was also acting on behalf of America in this regard? On behalf of the Biden administration, I should say.
That's an interesting question, and it's one to which I don't feel that I can necessarily offer any particular knowledge. On that particular act, I am inclined to believe that the peculiarities of Boris Johnson are more likely to be in play than anything else. That said, I mean, look, I mean, to start with, obviously, Ukraine's political independence, national life has been and still is very gravely threatened by Russia, and that's an absolute necessity. But the strategic environment in which the war is taking place is also a first order concern. That's true in serious analysis, I think, of any war, whether it's from Ethiopia to Ukraine to wherever. So, the general idea of looking at as, say, and I would insist, as, say, citizens of the UK or the US, that our first responsibility is to scrutinize the actions of the states where we are citizens, even if that scrutiny ends up coming to the conclusion that the current policy is correct. So in Britain, I think the idea has very much simply been, again, to follow the US line, provide whatever support that can be provided, support the Polish position as far as possible. That's also been important within the European context. And then I think in terms of expert opinion or opinion within the British Defence Intelligentsia, the idea has really taken hold that one can have a completely hawkish position to do with Russia, far beyond even, the idea that Russia has to be defeated in Ukraine. The idea of using the war to attrite Russian power in a more permanent sense is very popular. If you look at someone like Ruth Daemon, for example, at King's College London, her position has always been, and has some influence and so on, that any move towards future negotiations should be avoided because it would be too embarrassing considering the past rhetoric, or else because the prospect of freezing the war is unacceptable because then Russia would continue to have too much influence. And one could certainly see why those ideas are popular, but they remain, I would say, unchallenged in a way that is perhaps not even true in the US today. So that's interesting. The idea that Russia really has to be knocked out of the ranks to the great powers, or it can't be allowed to have any zone of strategic interest, that sort of thing is absolutely clear. So whether Johnson, was carrying a message from the Americans, acting on his own behalf, or didn't know what he was doing, I think is an interesting historical question, one very difficult to answer. But what is true is that the general attitude in Britain is very much to be, full-throated in support of moving toward a greater involvement in Eastern European politics more generally, against any kind of settlement or even negotiations with Russia on any score. And that's probably going to have to be a position that becomes more malleable in the future as the realities of the war kick in.
Yes, although I was struck by the fact that I thought our contribution of 14 main battle tanks to Ukraine was pretty pathetic after all our rhetoric. And then I discovered that actually that's 1/10 of our entire tank force, or possibly actually much more, given the suspicions that many of the tanks won't actually move and would need to be cannibalized. Um, I mean, is this what? So this is not really something you talk about in your book, but the obsession with Russia, which objectively speaking does not actually threaten Britain. I mean, Britain as a country at all, really, directly. I mean, the idea of the Russian Navy landing in Britain is a trifle fanciful, given what's happened to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Um, is this once again something that has come down from Victorian times and the Great Game? Where does it come from? Because clearly, I mean, this was present long before the invasion of Ukraine.
Certainly, absolutely. I think that's much more a simply a Cold War relic. I mean, in Britain, to an unusual extent, the intelligence services in particular really have been, organized around the idea of the threat of Russia, having assets in Russia, and so on, even to a greater extent than the US, which necessarily had more global purview than the UK did, ultimately going to be the lieutenant or the junior partner. So I think it's primarily a legacy of that. But as you say, I mean, the idea of Russia as a threat to Britain is, I mean, in conventional terms, is absurd. And in nuclear terms, there's just no context. Russia has, almost half the nuclear weapons in existence. Britain has, a couple of hundred, even if they're going to be increased. So, there's no serious challenge there. But nonetheless, politically, that idea, and taking an anti-Russian position or organizing national security around the threat of Russia, organizing, say, Arctic military exercises, that sort of thing, retains an importance far beyond its, practical necessity. And in some respects, that's been good because in the initial phases of the war in Ukraine, British solidarity was treated as a great positive and had, certainly, I was in favor of it. Russia, certainly preventing the initial Russian attack on Ukraine, very important. But it's something that needs to be watched because, again, it's there we get into the questions of illusions and delusions because the specter of Russia or of Britain as a strategic competitor with Russia, which it isn't but on both ends of the scale, neither as Russia is a real threat to Britain or as Britain is a real competitor with Russia in military terms, remains. And so, yeah, it's an important part of how the whole approach to national security is organized, and one which has a slightly distended idea about it.
A question to me from one of the audience, which really I think reflects the merging that we've been talking about. Someone asks, when I say we, what do you mean, Kemosabe, in the old Lone Ranger phrase? Am I talking about the US or the UK or both? I suppose the answer is both. I mean, we are both British citizens, so I use we in that sense. I am now, of course, resident in Washington and working for a US think tank. But of course, actually, when I was working for a think tank in London, and you mentioned Ruth Dermond, I also spent 7 years at the Department of War Studies in King's. And there, it's very clear that for most people, when they say we, they mean the United Kingdom and the United States, both. So I suppose the answer is both. I'm merged more than you are, I think. Perhaps one final question from the floor, because we're almost out of time. A verdict is expected tomorrow, I think, on the extradition of Julian Assange. I never know how to pronounce him. This is a pretty stark reminder of British and European subservience in general. Will there be any serious outrage on the part of progressive elements, at least in Britain and more widely in Europe, if the verdict goes as it's generally expected to?
There's no doubt that there will be. Yes, I mean, it is, as you say, a very stark reminder of the realities and of, the exigencies that subordination puts on one's plate. So again, it's a little bit like the situation with regard to the war in Gaza, in that popular opinion would be fully in favor of simply releasing Assange, perhaps not decorating him. But there's no question that there is no democratic, even plural support for extraditing Assange or even convicting him of anything. And yet, yes, it has been followed. We'll have to wait and see what the final result is. But the situation doesn't look good. As with Gaza, you can get massive rallies showing enormous amount of support from the progressive, organized primarily from the progressive side, organized primarily from the left within Britain, but nonetheless able to get mass support. And although it's unlikely that there will be massive street rallies in the same way in the case of Assange, who's ultimately an important but one person, still, that's the way the wind is blowing. So there's no question that some elements within the press on the progressive side, some who still, at least put on a good front of believing in the old freedom of expression stuff, will take serious umbrage about it. And yet it will ultimately be left to the, military intelligence, defense intelligence, and think tank world to make decisions on these things. And that will set the tone. There will be anger, there will be opposition. And because foreign policy, security questions, which the Assange case is taken to fall into because of how it played out, because it operates in that world, it has been kept apart from democratic decision making in the same way that the Iraq War or British foreign policy in general is. So that's how it's going to end up being viewed, I fear.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thank you so much. We're out of time, I'm afraid, but this has been a truly fascinating discussion. Perhaps I might end with one rather depressing comment from the audience. A schoolboy definition of empire that I read years ago: the pleasure of living with one's inferiors. On which sharp note, thank you for this discussion, and many thanks to the audience for your participation. I'm sorry I couldn't get to every question, and I look forward to seeing you all and Tom again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.